The night Sallie Merritt decided that Chester Fletcher hated her was the same night he was out behind her barn in the dark, driving fence posts into the ground with his bare hands bleeding, and his heart so full of her it nearly broke him in two. But she did not know that yet. Nobody ever knows the most important things until it is almost too late. Sallie had arrived in Harrow Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, stepping off the stage with a single trunk, a worn leather satchel, and the particular kind of quiet courage that women develop when they have survived enough loss to understand that grief does not kill you, even when it feels like it should. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair she kept pinned beneath a straw hat, and brown eyes that caught the light like creek water over smooth stones. She was not a fragile woman, not by any measure. She had buried her mother in Missouri, watched her father drink himself into an early grave 2 winters later, and then made the loneliest decision of her life: to answer an advertisement posted by a land agent in Harrow Creek, who was looking for a woman willing to take on the school-teaching post that the town had left vacant for nearly 8 months. Nobody in Harrow Creek thought she would last the summer. The town itself was a raw, sun-baked collection of buildings that squinted against the West Texas sky like a man trying to read fine print. There was a general store run by a widow named Hattie Pruitt, a saloon called the Red Dust that always smelled of sawdust and regret, a church with a crooked steeple that the congregation had been meaning to straighten for 3 years, and a schoolhouse that sat at the edge of the main road like a forgotten thought. The soil around Harrow Creek was good soil, the kind that could grow things if a person was patient enough and stubborn enough and willing to water it through the dry spells. But most of the land had been spoken for, carved up between a handful of cattle ranches that stretched out in every direction from the town center like the spokes of a great dusty wheel. The largest of those ranches belonged to the Fletcher family, though by 1882 it was really only Chester Fletcher running it, his father having passed from a rattlesnake bite 2 years prior, and his mother having gone back east to live with her sister. Chester was 31 years old, tall and lean in the way that men who work outdoors become lean, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that he kept just short enough to stay out of his eyes. He had a serious face, the kind that people often mistook for unfriendliness, a jaw that seemed to be set in permanent deliberation, and gray-green eyes that noticed everything, though he rarely said so out loud. He was not a man of many words. He had discovered early in life that most things did not require words so much as they required attention, and he paid very close attention to the world around him. He first saw Sallie Merritt on the morning of her second day in Harrow Creek, when she came into the general store to buy chalk and a broom, and whatever vegetable seeds Hattie Pruitt had on hand. He was there picking up a spool of wire and a sack of feed, and he stood to one side without meaning to eavesdrop, watching as Sallie examined the seed packets with the kind of focused interest that most women in Harrow Creek reserved for bolts of calico. She picked up a packet of tomato seeds, then a packet of marigolds, then squash, then something he could not quite read from where he was standing. "You planning a garden?" Hattie asked, leaning on the counter with her considerable arms folded. "I am planning to try," Sallie said, and her voice had a clear, steady quality to it that surprised him. "The schoolhouse yard is nothing but dust and rocks right now. I thought something growing might make it feel less bleak for the children." Hattie tilted her head and looked at her the way the older women of Harrow Creek looked at anyone new, with a mix of assessment and cautious warmth. "The soil out there is pretty hard-packed," she said. "Nobody's turned it in years." "Then I suppose I had better start turning it," Sallie said simply, and paid for her seeds. Chester Fletcher walked out of the general store that morning without introducing himself, without saying a single word to Sallie Merritt, and he did not stop thinking about her for the rest of the day. He could not have said exactly why. It was not only that she was pretty, though she was, in a way that had nothing to do with vanity. It was more the way she had said, "Then I suppose I had better start turning it," as if the difficulty of a thing was simply the beginning of a plan and not a reason to give up. He told himself he was being foolish and went back to his ranch, and did not think about her again until the next morning, when he thought about her constantly. It was another week before they actually spoke to each other, and the circumstances were less than dignified. Sallie had been out behind the schoolhouse with a pickaxe she had borrowed from the church deacon, hacking at the dried-out earth in the yard. She had been at it for 2 hours, and had made what she privately admitted was a discouraging amount of progress. The ground was laced with caliche, that peculiar white mineral that sits just beneath the West Texas surface like a stone lid on everything trying to grow, and it fought her at every stroke. She did not hear Chester Fletcher ride up, and when he spoke from behind her, she was so startled that she swung the pickaxe sideways and it glanced off a rock and the handle cracked clean in two. She turned around, heart hammering, and looked up at the man on the bay horse. "I did not mean to startle you," he said. He looked at the broken handle in her hands with what she could not tell was concern or something closer to disapproval. "I broke the deacon's pickaxe," she said, which was not the most dignified thing she could have said, but it was what was true. "You did," he agreed. There was a pause. "I am Chester Fletcher," he said. "I run the Fletcher Ranch a couple miles north. I saw you out here yesterday from the road and thought I would come see if you needed anything." She looked at him. He had a way of looking at things, including her, that felt very direct and not unkind but not exactly warm either. She was not sure what to make of him. "Sallie Merritt," she said. "I am the new school teacher, and I was trying to break up the ground for a garden." "I can see that." Another pause. "The ground out here has a caliche layer about 8 inches down," he said. "You could chip at it with a pickaxe all summer and not get through it in a meaningful way. You need a proper breaking plow to cut through the first time." She looked down at the broken handle. "I see," she said, and though she kept her voice level, something in her expression shifted, and he saw it clearly, that particular expression of a person recalculating a plan they had already staked too much hope on. "I have a plow," he said. She looked back up at him. "I could bring it by on Saturday morning," he said. "It would take less than an hour to break the surface properly. After that, a hoe would do the rest." She studied him for a moment with those brown eyes, trying to determine if this was charity or something practical. "I would be grateful," she said at last. "I can pay you for your time." He shook his head. "No need." He gathered his reins. "Saturday morning, then." He rode away without further ceremony, and Sallie stood in the dusty yard with the broken pickaxe handle and watched him go, and thought, "That is the most quietly direct man I have ever encountered in my life." He came on Saturday morning with a mule and a breaking plow, and he worked the ground in the schoolhouse yard with efficient, unhurried skill, turning the caliche-stiffened earth into dark furrows that smelled, remarkably, like rain even though the sky was clear and blue. Sallie came out with coffee in 2 tin mugs and sat on the schoolhouse step and watched him work, and he did not talk much, but when he did it was worth listening to. He told her which seeds would do best in the West Texas sun, which ones needed more water than she was likely to have easy access to, which direction the rows should run to catch the most light. He knew the land the way some people know a language, not by thinking about it but by speaking it directly. When he finished, she handed him the second mug of coffee and he sat on the step beside her, not close but not distant, and they looked out at the broken earth together. "It will grow," he said. "I believe you," she said. That was all. But something about the simplicity of that exchange stayed with her long after he had collected his mule and left. The weeks that followed were full and useful. School started in the second week of April, and Sallie threw herself into the work with a passion that surprised even the children's parents, who had been skeptical of this quiet young woman from Missouri. She organized the schoolroom, repaired the window that had been letting in weather, and began to teach with a thoroughness and warmth that quickly won over the reluctant hearts of the 22 children who filled those rough benches every morning. She planted her garden on the weekends, kneeling in the soil with her sleeves rolled up, pressing seeds into the dark earth that Chester had broken for her, and she watered it in the evenings with a bucket from the well. Chester Fletcher found reasons to ride past the schoolhouse more often than was strictly necessary. He told himself it was because the road that ran past the schoolhouse was simply the most direct route to the south pasture. He told himself this on Monday, and on Wednesday, and on Friday, and by the following Tuesday, he had stopped bothering to tell himself anything at all and simply rode by in the late afternoon and watched from the road as Sallie Merritt moved between her garden rows with her straw hat and her watering bucket, and felt something in his chest he had not felt in a very long time, something inconveniently and wonderfully alive. He stopped occasionally on the pretext of checking on the garden's progress. She would come to the fence to speak with him, and they would talk about seeds and soil and rainfall and the children in her class, and gradually they began to talk about other things too. He learned that she had grown up in a small house outside of Columbia, Missouri, that her father had been a schoolteacher himself before drink took hold, that she had taught herself to read Latin from a book she found in a water-damaged crate at a church sale. She learned that he had been educated by his mother, who had gone to school back east before she married a ranching man, that he had once tried to read Moby Dick and found it admirable but impractical, that he had a younger sister in San Antonio who sent letters he answered promptly but poorly. She found him easier to talk to than she had initially expected. The serious face was the face of a man who was thinking, not disapproving. Once she understood that, she stopped feeling scrutinized and started feeling, rather pleasantly, listened to. The trouble, when it came, began with a misunderstanding. Most troubles do. It was a Thursday in July, and the heat had been ferocious for 2 weeks, a relentless baking heat that turned the road to powder and cracked the lips and made everyone in Harrow Creek short-tempered. The garden at the schoolhouse was suffering. Sallie had been carrying extra water to it every morning before the children arrived and every evening after they left, but the tomatoes were wilting, and the marigolds had gone thin and yellow at the edges. It broke her heart in a way that surprised her, that quiet grief over something small and green and struggling, because she had put more into that garden than just seeds. She had put hope into it, a stubborn, optimistic sort of hope that was perhaps the thing she was most proud of in herself. On that Thursday she was at the general store, and Hattie Prout was telling her, in the kind and apologetic way that Hattie delivered all bad news, that the well at the east end of town had begun to drop, and the town council was talking about whether people needed to start rationing their water use. "The schoolhouse well is pretty shallow," Hattie said. "Always has been. You might want to start thinking about that garden of yours, honey." Sallie bought what she needed and walked out, and as she came around the corner of the general store, she nearly walked directly into Chester Fletcher, who was coming up the steps with his hat in his hand. He saw her and she saw him, and for a moment she thought he was going to smile. But instead, something changed in his expression. His brow pulled together and his jaw tightened, and he looked at her with that intense, focused look of his and said, "Miss Merritt, I was just coming to find you." Her heart did a small, undignified thing at that, before his next words stopped it entirely. "I need to talk to you about the garden," he said. Something about the way he said it, combined with the look on his face and the heat of the day and the worry she was already carrying, landed wrong. He looked, in that moment, not like a man who was concerned, but like a man who was about to deliver bad news of the hard-edged variety. Like a man who had made a decision that he was going to impose on her whether she liked it or not. "What about it?" she said, keeping her voice careful. He opened his mouth, then seemed to reconsider something, then said, "Can we speak privately? Tomorrow evening, if you have time, come by the ranch." It was an unusual request. She studied his face and found it in that moment unreadable. The jaw set, the eyes serious, the posture of a man who had made up his mind about something. "I suppose so," she said, though a strange cold feeling had begun to settle in her chest. He nodded, replaced his hat, and walked past her into the store. Sallie stood on the boardwalk for a moment in the crushing July heat and tried to understand what she had just seen in his face. And the story she told herself, because she was a woman who had learned early to brace for disappointment, was that Chester Fletcher had decided the garden was a problem, that the water she was using was a problem, that she was, in some way she had not fully understood, overstepping, that the kindness he had shown her in plowing that ground in April had been, in his mind, a limited thing, and she had used up more of it than she was entitled to. She walked back to the schoolhouse with a tight, miserable feeling in her stomach, and when she got there, she looked at her struggling garden and felt, for the first time since she had arrived in Harrow Creek, genuinely defeated. She did not sleep well that night. She arrived at the Fletcher ranch the following evening in the long golden light that came before sunset in July, a light that turned everything soft and amber and almost unbearably beautiful against the hard landscape. The ranch was tidy and well kept in the way of a man who worked hard and had clear standards, a solid barn, a main house built of wood and adobe, a kitchen garden visible at the side of the house with its neat rows. She tied her borrowed horse at the hitching post and went up to the door and knocked. Chester answered almost immediately. He was in his work clothes still, and he had a strange expression on his face when he saw her, almost hesitant, which was so unlike him that it increased her anxiety rather than settling it. "Thank you for coming," he said, and held the door open. She stepped inside. The main room was spare and lived in, a work table covered with papers and maps, a stone fireplace, shelves of books that she noticed with some surprise were substantial in number. He gestured to the chairs at the table and she sat, and he sat across from her, and for a moment he seemed to be trying to figure out where to begin. She decided she could not bear the suspense of it. "If this is about the water," she said, keeping her voice steady and dignified even though her hands were very slightly shaking in her lap, "I want you to know that I understand. I have heard about the well situation in town, and if the garden is creating a problem for the community, then I will let it go. I would rather lose the garden than cause any difficulty." He stared at her. "I'm not ungrateful for what you did in the spring," she went on, because once she had started she found she needed to get through all of it. "Plowing that ground, giving your time, all of that. I am sorry if I have somehow taken advantage of your generosity. That was never my intention." Chester Fletcher looked at her across the table with an expression she could not entirely read, and then he said, "Sallie." It was the first time he had used her given name. It stopped her completely. "I was not coming to talk to you about any problem," he said. "Not with the water, not with the garden." Paused, and something worked across his face that she slowly recognized as the expression of a man choosing his words with very great care. "I was coming to tell you that I have been thinking about the garden situation and about the heat, and that I have a plan, but I did not want to do anything without your agreement." She stared at him. "A plan," she said. "I have a secondary water source on the north side of my property," he said. "A spring-fed tank that does not drop even in the dry season. I was thinking about running a pipe." He unfolded one of the maps on the table and she could see markings on it, pencil lines running from a point marked spring tank toward the south, toward the road, toward where the schoolhouse would be. "It is not a simple project, but it is possible. The school is only about 1.5 miles from the tank as the line runs." She looked at the map. Then she looked at him. "You are going to run a water line," she said slowly, "to the schoolhouse." "To the schoolhouse garden," he said. "And to the schoolhouse itself, which also has a shallow well situation that is going to become a problem come August." He sat back. "I wanted to ask if you thought it was worth doing before I committed the materials and the labor." The tight feeling in Sallie's chest did not so much dissolve as it simply collapsed, like a wall that had been holding its breath. She felt, suddenly and acutely, the full weight of what she had assumed about him, the tightened jaw and the serious face, and the fear she had carried for the last 2 days that he was angry with her, that she had somehow used up her welcome in his good graces. She felt it all at once, and behind it, rushing in to fill the space, was something she was not quite ready to name. "I think," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, That is the most generous thing anyone has offered me in a very long time." He looked at her directly, those gray-green eyes quiet and certain. "Then I will start on it Monday." She stood up when she should have taken her leave. But instead of leaving, she went to the window and looked out at the dry Texas landscape in the dimming gold light and said, without entirely meaning to, "I thought you were angry with me." The silence that followed was long enough that she turned around. Chester had not moved from his chair, but something in him had shifted, and the careful, contained expression he usually wore had loosened into something raw and uncalculated. "Angry," he said, as if the word did not quite fit in his mouth. "No," he shook his head slowly. "No, Sallie, not that." "What then?" she asked, and she was a braver woman than most to ask it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I have been trying to figure out how to be useful to you without overstepping. That is what I have been thinking about, not what you were afraid I was thinking about." She understood that. She understood it perfectly, and it settled something in her that had been unsettled for a long time. She left the ranch that evening as the last light went out of the sky, riding back along the road toward town with the evening stars beginning to appear above her, and she thought about Chester Fletcher and his maps and his spring-fed tank and his careful, serious face, and she thought, "I have been very foolish, and I am very glad I was wrong." What she did not know was what Chester had done the night before she came to visit him. What she did not know was that he had spent 4 hours in the dark, after the last daylight left the sky, behind the schoolhouse, in the dust and the dark, turning the hard ground with a post-hole digger and a spade, extending the prepared ground of her existing garden by nearly twice its original size, laying down rich composted soil he had brought from his own barn in 2 sacks on his horse, and setting corner posts for a proper fence to protect it from rabbits and the stray livestock that wandered through town. His hands had been cut and raw by the time he finished, and he had ridden home in the full dark with the stars above him and the smell of fresh earth on his clothes, feeling more genuinely purposeful than he had felt in years. He had not told her because he had not finished. He wanted to finish before she saw it. On a Sunday morning, Sallie arrived at the schoolhouse to water her garden before the day warmed up, and she stopped dead at the fence line. The garden had doubled. No, more than doubled. Where before there had been a modest rectangle of turned earth, now there were neat extended rows running all the way to the back of the yard, bounded by 4 solid corner posts with wire run between them and a proper gate in the front. The soil in the new section was dark and rich, clearly not the pale, hard-packed caliche of the schoolhouse yard. Someone had brought it in. The corner posts were solid and even, obviously driven by a person who knew how to set a post correctly, which meant someone who had done it many hundreds of times. She stood at the gate for a long time, and the morning birds were singing in the scrubby trees at the edge of the yard, and the early sun was warm on her back, and she felt something move through her that she had no specific name for, though it was somewhere between wonder and the particular ache of being cared for when you had not expected to be. She went to Hattie's store, because Hattie knew everything about everything in Harrow Creek. Chester Fletcher was over behind the schoolhouse Friday night, Hattie said, with the calm satisfaction of a woman delivering information she has been waiting to deliver. Elvira Moss's husband Sam saw him from the road when he was coming back late from checking his stock, said he had a post-hole digger and 2 big sacks of soil, and was working in the dark like a man who was trying to get something done before anyone noticed. Sallie stood at Hattie's counter and said, "Friday night." "Friday night," Hattie confirmed, watching her with bright, careful eyes. Friday night was the night before Sallie had come to the ranch. The night before she had told him she thought he was angry with her. The night before she had learned about the water line and the spring-fed tank and all the other plans he had been quietly making. She stood there and let the full shape of it settle over her, what he had done and when he had done it and why he had not said a word about it himself. She found Chester Fletcher at his ranch that same Sunday afternoon in the barn mending a piece of harness. He looked up when she came in, and he must have seen something in her face because he set the harness down and stood up and waited. "You built the garden," she said. He was still for a moment. "I extended it," he said. It needed more room. In the dark, she said. Friday night. He nodded once. Why did you not tell me? She asked. And then, because she needed to be honest, she said, I had been worrying about you. I had convinced myself you were upset with me about something, and you were out there in the dark extending my garden, and I was lying awake thinking you had decided I was a problem. Something flickered in his eyes, something she thought might have been pain or maybe tenderness or perhaps both at once. He crossed the barn toward her, slow and deliberate, and stopped when there was only a few feet between them. I am sorry you worried, he said. That was not my intention. What was your intention? She asked. He looked at her steadily. I wanted to give you something that was yours, he said. Something that would last. I know what it means to plant something in new ground. My parents built this ranch from a patch of grass and a prayer, and my mother used to say that a person needed at least one thing growing that was entirely their own, something they planted and tended and could look at and say, I did that. He paused. I wanted that for you. Sallie Merritt had survived a great deal in her 26 years, and she had developed a formidable capacity for composure in difficult moments. She called on that composure now and found it, to her mild surprise, somewhat unwilling to cooperate. Chester, she said. Yes, he said. I think I have been looking at you wrong, she said. I think I let the serious look on your face make me think you were harder than you are. He made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Most people do, he said. I do not hold it against them. I am not most people, she said. I should have looked more carefully. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. You can look as carefully as you like, he said. I do not mind. She felt the warmth of that settle over her like the evening light. She took one step closer to him, and he held very still, like a man not wanting to startle something that might otherwise stay, and she said, Thank you, for the garden, for all of it. He reached out slowly with his right hand, and touched her fingers where they hung at her side, just a brief, light pressure. You are welcome, he said. They stood like that for a moment in the quiet barn with the smell of hay and horses around them, and the Sunday afternoon light coming through the boards in amber slats, and it was not a dramatic moment by any external measure. But something shifted between them in that barn. Some understanding that had been approaching for months finally arrived, and both of them felt it. The weeks that followed had a different quality to them, softer and more deliberate, like a song being played at the right speed for the first time. Chester began coming to the schoolhouse on Friday afternoons, not to work, but simply to walk with Sallie along the road when school let out. They would walk until the road curved north toward his ranch, and then they would stand at the curve and talk for whatever time was left of the afternoon light, and then she would walk south back toward town, and he would walk north toward home, and both of them would carry the conversation with them into the evening. He told her things he had not told anyone in a long time. He told her about his father, who had been a quiet man like him, a man who showed love through work and presence rather than declaration, and who had died so suddenly from that rattlesnake bite that Chester had not had the chance to say goodbye. He told her about the loneliness of the ranch after his mother left, how the silence had been different from useful working silence, how it had had a quality of emptiness that bothered him more than he let on. He told her that he had been considering selling part of the land's southern acreage because managing all of it alone was becoming impossible, but that he hated the idea of diminishing what his father had built. She told him things too. She told him about the last weeks of her mother's illness and how she had read to her every evening, whatever book was nearest to hand, anything to fill the room with sound. She told him about the decision to come west, how terrifying it had been and how necessary, how she had felt the need to put enough distance between herself and the weight of her grief to have room to breathe again. She told him that the garden at the schoolhouse had become, in a way she had not anticipated, the thing that anchored her to Harrow Creek, the growing proof that she was not just passing through. He listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, with complete attention and no performance of reaction, and she found that she had come to trust that quality in him more than she trusted most people's enthusiasm. In August, the water pipe project began. Chester enlisted two of his ranch hands, a solid man named Grady and a young fellow called Tom Wick, and they spent 2 weeks laying pipe from the spring-fed tank, across the northern pasture, and through a drainage easement, to the road, and then south toward the schoolhouse. It was heavy, difficult work in the August heat, and Sallie would bring water and cornbread out to them in the afternoons, and Chester would thank her, and she would thank him, and they would find themselves standing closer together than was strictly necessary for the exchange of cornbread. Tom Wick, who was 22 and romantic in the way that young men with no romantic experience often are, said to Grady one afternoon in a low voice, "You notice how the boss doesn't stop looking at the schoolteacher?" Grady, who was 43 and had seen a great deal of the world, said, "Son, I notice how they don't stop looking at each other, and I'm going to suggest you mind your work before Mr. Fletcher notices you noticing." The pipe reached the schoolhouse in the 3rd week of August, and Chester connected it to a simple spigot at the edge of the garden, and when he turned the water on and it came through clear and steady, Sallie, who was standing beside him, made a sound of pure joy that startled the birds out of the nearby trees. "It works," she said, and she turned to him with her eyes bright and her smile enormous, and Chester Fletcher, looking at her in that unguarded, illuminated moment, felt something in his chest that had been folded closed for a very long time open itself up like a field. He almost kissed her right then. He did not, because Tom Wick was standing 7 feet away pretending to examine the pipe connection with tremendous focus. But almost. The garden, given water, transformed with an enthusiasm that felt personal. The tomatoes straightened and reddened and grew with visible determination. The marigolds burned orange and gold. The squash sent long green vines sprawling toward the edges of their neat rows. Some of the children from Sallie's class began coming in after school to help tend it, and she taught them about soil and seeds and the patience that growing things required. And it was some of the best teaching she had ever done, because it was teaching that could be eaten. It was at the harvest of the first tomatoes, on a warm September evening, that Chester Fletcher made up his mind about something he had been making up his mind about for 4 months. He came to the schoolhouse after the children had gone home, and found Sallie sitting on the step with a basket of red tomatoes in her lap, sorting through them. Her sleeves rolled up, and her hair coming loose from its pins, and a smear of garden dirt across her left wrist. She looked up when she heard his horse, and smiled, and it was the smile she saved for him, wider and less guarded than the general smile she gave the world. He dismounted and sat on the step beside her without being invited, which was how far they had come in 5 months, and she handed him a tomato from the basket. He ate it and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to ask you something." She waited. "I would like to ask you to come to supper at the ranch on Saturday," he said. "A proper supper, not to discuss water lines or soil composition." He paused. "I am not very practiced at this kind of thing, but I think you know what I mean by it." She looked at him sideways in the golden September light. "I think I do," she said, "and yes, I will come." He looked so briefly and purely relieved that she almost laughed, except that the relief was too sincere to be funny and was instead entirely affecting. "Good," he said, and ate the rest of his tomato in dignified quiet. She came to supper on Saturday, and he had cooked, badly but genuinely, a beef stew and a pan of biscuits that were slightly lopsided but tasted fine. He had put wildflowers on the table in a tin cup, a gesture so simple and so deliberately made that it was harder to look at than something more elaborate would have been. They ate and talked for 3 hours, and when the candle on the table burned low, Sallie looked at the flowers in the tin cup and then looked at Chester Fletcher across the table and thought, "I am in love with this man." She thought it clearly and completely, without the qualifiers she usually wrapped around her feelings, and the thought sat inside her chest like a warm coal, glowing steadily. She did not say it that night, but she thought it, and the thinking of it was itself a declaration, private and absolute. Chester walked her to her horse when she left, and they stood in the dark yard of the ranch with the stars enormous and close above them, the way they are in West Texas where there is nothing tall enough to interrupt them. "I enjoyed tonight," she said. "So did I," he said. He put his hand against her face, slow and deliberate, his palm warm against her cheek, and looked at her in the way that he looked at things he valued, which was to say with his complete and serious attention. And then he leaned forward and kissed her, gentle and certain, a kiss that did not apologize for itself or hurry, and she kissed him back. And there was a moment that held them both that had nothing to do with Texas or 1882 or drought or gardens or water pipes or any of the practical pieces of their daily lives, only the two of them in the dark with the stars pouring down around them like slow light. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that since April," he said. "Since April," she said, and the wonder in her voice was genuine. "At the general store," he said, "when you said you supposed you had better start turning the soil." She laughed, and the laugh broke the solemnity in the best possible way, and he smiled, actually smiled, the full unreserved smile that she had been working toward for months, and it was worth every bit of the working. She rode home in the dark under those stars and thought that the West Texas sky was one of the finest things she had ever seen, and that she would not be going back to Missouri. The autumn that followed was the best season Sallie had ever known. She had the school and the garden and the long Friday afternoon walks and the Saturday suppers at the ranch, and she had Chester Fletcher's steady, serious presence moving through all of it like a current beneath a river, visible in its effects even when it was not visible itself. He fixed the leak in the schoolhouse roof that the church deacon had been meaning to get to for 6 months. He showed her how to save seeds from her best tomatoes for next year's planting. He introduced her to his sister, Clara, when she came up from San Antonio in October, and Clara was a dark-eyed, quick-talking woman who shook Sallie's hand and said, "He has written me about you in every single letter since April, and refused to admit it directly," which made Sallie laugh and made Chester look at his sister with the expression of a man who is wishing, in a purely hypothetical way, that his family lived slightly farther away. But Clara approved, which Chester would never have admitted mattered to him as much as it did. Their mother, when he wrote to tell her about Sallie, wrote back a letter of such enthusiastic warmth that it embarrassed him slightly and moved him considerably, and he read parts of it to Sallie on a Sunday afternoon and watched her eyes fill with an emotion she controlled before it could become tears, and understood that being welcomed by a family was something she had been without for long enough that it landed unexpectedly hard. He took her hand and did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and she held on to his and breathed through it, and after a while she was fine. October turned cool as West Texas gets, which is not very cold by northern standards, but carries a particular crisp clarity that makes the light look freshly washed. The garden went to its autumn sleep, and Sallie covered the beds with straw and made plans on paper for the spring planting, sitting at the work table in Chester's ranch house on Sunday evenings while he read or worked on his accounts nearby. And the domestic ease of it was so comfortable and so natural that it sometimes surprised her, how quickly she had grown used to the weight of his presence in a room. One Sunday evening in late October she was sitting at the table with her planting papers and he was at the hearth adding a log to the fire, and she looked up at him in the firelight and said, "Chester." "Yes," he said, not turning yet. "I love you," she said, because she was a direct person when she allowed herself to be, and because she had been carrying the thought since September and it had grown large enough that it wanted air. He turned from the fire. He looked at her across the room for a long moment with the fire behind him and the quiet ranch house around them. Then he came to her and crouched down beside her chair so that they were level and put his hands on either side of her face the way he had done under the stars in September. "I love you, Sallie," he said. "I have been working up to saying it properly for weeks and you just said it first." "Was that all right?" she asked. "It was perfect," he said. Everything about you is perfect." She made a small sound of skepticism at that, because she was a practical woman, and he kissed her before she could argue the point. He asked her to marry him in November. He did it in the garden, because that felt right to both of them even if he had not planned it that way. He had come by on a November Saturday when the air had bite and the sky was the deep winter blue of late autumn, and she was out checking the straw mulch on the beds, making sure the frost had not crept under the covering. He stood at the gate for a moment watching her, and then he went in through the gate and crossed the dormant garden and stood beside her, and she looked up at him and saw something in his face. "Sallie," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring, small and gold with a single dark garnet set in it. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "My mother sent it with Clara when she visited. I have been carrying it for 3 weeks." She looked at the ring, then she looked at him. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not in Harrow Creek, or not only that, I mean with me. I want to build something with you. The way my parents built the ranch, except I want to start with a better foundation than they had, because I already know what I am building toward and I have known since April." He paused. "I am asking if you will marry me, Sallie. I am asking it plainly because I do not know how to ask anything otherwise." She looked at him in the bright cold November light in her garden. This serious, quiet, good man who had broken her ground in the spring and built her fence in the dark and run water across 1.5 miles of West Texas to keep her tomatoes alive. And she said, "Yes, Chester, yes, I will." He put the ring on her finger and pulled her into his arms with a conviction that surprised her with its warmth. This man who was so careful and contained with everything, holding her as if she were something he had been afraid of losing. And she put her arms around him and held on, and the cold air moved around them in the garden. And somewhere nearby, a mockingbird was singing with tremendous ambition for a November morning. They married in the spring of 1883, on a Saturday in April, which was almost exactly 1 year after the morning Chester Fletcher had stood in Hattie Pruitt's store and watched Sallie Merritt buy marigold seeds. The wedding was held in the church with the crooked steeple, which the congregation had finally gotten around to straightening in February, and the whole of Harrow Creek came, because the whole of Harrow Creek had been watching this particular story develop for 11 months and considered themselves to have a vested interest in the outcome. Clara came up from San Antonio and cried without apology through the whole ceremony. Hattie Pruitt stood in the front row and beamed with the satisfaction of a woman who has known from the beginning how something would end. Tom Wick and Grady sat together near the back, and Tom said, very quietly, "I told you they couldn't stop looking at each other." And Grady said, with immense dignity, "You did not tell me anything I did not already know." Sallie wore a dress of cream-colored cotton with small blue flowers that Hattie had helped her sew over the winter months, and she had flowers from her own dried marigolds pressed into the ribbon of her hat, and she walked up the aisle of that church on her own 2 feet, because she had no father to give her away and no one else who had the right, and she held her head straight and her eyes clear, and when she reached Chester at the front she saw in his face the expression she had come to love best, that unguarded, fully open expression that she alone seemed to bring out of him, and she thought, "Here is where I belong. Here is exactly where I belong." They spoke their vows in clear voices, each of them looking at the other with the steadiness of people who have thought carefully about what they are promising and intend to keep it. The ranch that Sallie moved into in April of 1883 was different from the ranch she had visited as a guest. It was the same building, the same fields, the same solid barn and the same good order, but now it was hers as much as his, and she moved through it with a sense of ownership that surprised her with its completeness. She brought her books and arranged them on the shelves beside his. She hung curtains in the bedroom window, yellow ones, because she felt the room needed color. She put a kitchen garden in at the side of the house that first month, and it grew, that first summer of her marriage, with the enthusiasm of something that knows where it is supposed to be. She continued teaching. Chester had never suggested she should stop, and she had never considered it. The school was hers and she was its, and the 22 children who arrived at those rough benches every morning were in her care, and she did not take that lightly. She rode to school on the horse Chester kept saddled for her every morning, and rode back every afternoon, and the 2 miles between the ranch and the schoolhouse became one of her favorite parts of the day, a space in which she could think and breathe and watch the West Texas landscape shift through its moods. The garden at the schoolhouse flourished in its second year with the full benefit of the spring-fed water line and the richer soil and the additional space. And in May of 1883, Sallie organized the first school harvest festival in the history of Harrow Creek, where the children brought produce from the garden and their families came, and there were tables set up in the schoolyard, and Hattie brought pies and Chester brought sweet corn from the ranch kitchen garden. And the whole thing was, by general consensus, the finest afternoon that Harrow Creek had seen in at least a decade. Chester stood at the edge of the schoolyard that afternoon and watched Sallie in the middle of it all, talking to parents and laughing with children, and moving through the gathering with her particular quality of complete presence, of being exactly where she was and nowhere else, and he felt a happiness that was so large and so settled it had nothing anxious in it at all. His sister Clara, who had come up for the occasion, appeared at his elbow. "You look like a man who cannot believe his luck," she said. "I cannot," he said simply. Clara looked at him, then she looked at Sallie, then she looked back at him. "She is remarkable," she said. "I know it," he said. "Does she know you think so?" He smiled, the real one, the one that had taken Sallie 5 months to coax out of him, and that was now somewhat easier to find. "I tell her," he said. Clara blinked, and then she laughed. "You have improved considerably," she said. It was Clara on that same visit who told them that their mother was thinking of coming back west. The doctors back east had found nothing wrong with her. She was simply aging, and she had confided to Clara in a recent letter that she missed Texas in a way she had not expected, and that the idea of being near Chester again and of meeting his wife was a powerful draw. Chester wrote to his mother that same evening and told her to come. He told her that the ranch had room, and that there was no reason at all she should be sitting in a drawing room in the east when there was a West Texas sky she had always loved, and a daughter-in-law he very much wanted her to meet. His mother, Eleanor Fletcher, arrived in Harrow Creek in August of 1883. A compact and sharp-eyed woman of 60 who stepped off the stage and looked at the landscape with the expression of a woman returning to something that had always been hers, and that she had been foolish to leave. She embraced Chester with a fierceness that he bore without complaint, and then she turned to Sallie and took both her hands and looked at her with those same gray-green eyes her son had inherited. "He wrote me about your garden," she said. "He said you bought marigold seeds before you bought anything else when you arrived in town." "I suppose I did," Sallie said. "That tells me everything I needed to know about you," Eleanor said, and smiled, and Sallie understood at once where Chester's directness came from. Eleanor Fletcher took the small bedroom at the back of the ranch house and folded herself into the life of the Fletcher ranch with an ease that seemed to say she had simply been away for a while and was now back where she belonged. She and Sallie arrived at a friendship that was genuine rather than obligatory, built on a shared love of books and a shared appreciation for Chester's particular, quiet devotion, and a shared impatience with anything pretentious or unnecessary. They talked in the evenings after supper while Chester worked on the ranch accounts, and often he would look up from his papers and find them deep in conversation, and would feel a quiet gratitude so complete it was almost indistinguishable from joy. In the autumn of 1883, Sallie told Chester one morning before he rode out that she was expecting their first child. He had been checking the cinch on his saddle, and he turned around and looked at her in the doorway of the barn, and the expression on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not a contained expression. It was not the careful, deliberate face of a man managing his response. It was simply joy, pure and uncalculated, the face of a man caught entirely off guard by happiness, He crossed the barn and took her face in his hands and kissed her, and then he held her for a long time, and she could feel his heart beating fast against her cheek. "Are you well?" he said when he finally pulled back enough to look at her properly. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Good," he said. "You will tell me if that changes." "I will tell you," she said. Alina was delighted in the restrained way of a woman who has been waiting for this news for some time, and will not admit to having been waiting. Hattie Prout, when told, said immediately, "Boy or girl, that child is going to be something, coming from the two of you," which was the finest compliment she knew how to give. The baby arrived in the middle of a February night in 1884, a long and difficult labor that Chester endured by staying as close as he was permitted and trusting the capable hands of Myra Jansen, the midwife, and trying not to let Sallie see that he was afraid. She knew anyway, of course, because she knew him better than he gave her credit for, and there were moments between contractions when she looked at him beside her and saw his gray-green eyes dark with fear, and she held his hand tighter than perhaps was necessary, and he held hers back without flinching. The baby was a boy. He was a healthy, red-faced, loudly indignant boy who announced his arrival with extraordinary volume. And Chester, when Myra placed the baby in his arms, stood in the lamplight of their bedroom holding his son with the specific careful terror of a large, competent man holding something infinitely more precious than anything he has ever held, and looked down at this small, furious, extraordinary person, and then looked up at Sallie, who was exhausted and luminous and watching him from the pillow. "He is perfect," Chester said. "He is very loud," Sallie said with enormous warmth. "He gets that from you," Chester said, and she laughed, weak and beautiful, and Alina Fletcher, standing in the doorway with her hand over her mouth and her eyes full, laughed too. They named him James Robert Fletcher, James for Sallie's father before the drink took him, when he had been a good man and a good teacher, and Robert for Chester's father, who had been both those things until the rattlesnake ended it. It felt right to give the boy the names of two men who had been worth honoring, and who would have, each in his own way, loved him. James was, from the beginning, a child of considerable personality. He had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's auburn hair, and it emerged over his first year of life, a disposition that combined Chester's deliberate thoughtfulness with Sallie's open warmth in a way that made him generally impossible to resist. Chester would bring him to the garden in the mornings, holding him against his shoulder, and James would look at everything with the serious, interested face of a small person who is taking careful inventory of the world, and Sallie would watch from the step and think that she had never seen anything so purely right as her husband and her son in the morning garden. The years that followed were full years, built years, years in which the Fletcher Ranch and the Harrow Creek schoolhouse and the garden with its spring-fed water line became the center of a life that was larger than either of them had managed to build alone. Chester took on a second ranch hand, a steady older man named Paul, and together with Grady and Tom Wick, they worked the land through the dry seasons and the good ones, and the ranch became profitable enough that Chester paid off the last of his father's debts in 1885 and stood in the ranch house kitchen and told Sallie, and she put her arms around him and felt his relief as if it were her own. She taught school until the second child was nearly born, in the spring of 1886, and then she handed the school over to a young teacher named Emmett Boyd who came from Austin, and who she trained carefully and seriously through the autumn before his start, making him learn the particular qualities of each child and the particular needs of the schoolhouse, and the ways in which a West Texas classroom differed from an Austin one. She told him about the garden and the water line and the harvest festival, and she told him to maintain all of it, and he did. The second child was a girl, born in April of 1886, and they named her Rosa, for the wild roses that grew along the creek bed, and for the marigolds that had started everything, and for the life that had come from a packet of seeds and a planting plan, and a night when a man in the dark extended a garden that a woman thought might be dying. Rosa was a different kind of child from James, louder in some ways and quieter in others, curious about everything mechanical, following Chester around the ranch at an age when she could barely walk, pointing at tools and equipment and demanding explanations. By the time she was 4, she could identify every piece of farming equipment in the barn, which delighted her father and mildly terrified everyone else. Eleanor Fletcher lived at the ranch for 3 more years, deeply contented, before her health began to decline in 1887. She grew slower and more easily tired, and the West Texas summers became difficult for her, and she and Sallie would sit in the cooler part of the house in the afternoons and read together while Chester checked on her whenever he came in from the fields, quiet and present, and doing all the practical things that needed doing without being asked. Eleanor saw in those months very clearly the man her son had become and told him so on a September evening when they were sitting alone on the porch. "Your father would have loved her," she said. "I know it," Chester said. "He would have been very proud of you," she said. "Not for the ranch, for the way you built your life." She looked at him in the evening light. "You did it right, Chester. You took your time and you paid attention and you got it right." He was quiet for a moment. "I had a good example," he said. She smiled and put her small hand over his large one on the armrest, and they sat together in the evening until the stars came out. Eleanor Fletcher died peacefully in October of 1887 in her room at the back of the ranch house, with Chester on one side and Sallie on the other and both children sleeping in the next room. It was a gentle death, quiet and complete, and Chester bore it with the same steadiness he brought to everything, which did not mean he did not grieve, but that his grief had the quality of his love, deep and constant, and not given to performance. Sallie held him that night after the children were settled, and he put his head against her shoulder in the dark in a way he had never done before, and she held him without saying anything, because she had learned from him that some things do not require words so much as they require presence, and she was present, completely and entirely. He wept quietly, and she held on. In the morning he was himself again, quiet and deliberate, making the arrangements that needed making, writing the letters that needed writing. But he kissed Sallie when he came in for coffee, long and close, and she understood that the kiss was also a thank you for the night before. Life in Harrow Creek continued to move and change through the late 1880s, as life does in a growing territory. The town expanded. A second general store opened, which Hattie viewed with equanimity and some private irritation. A telegraph line came through in 1887, connecting Harrow Creek to the wider world in a way that felt, to Sallie, simultaneously exciting and slightly melancholy, as if the remoteness that had made the town its own world was now slightly reduced. The railroad was rumored to be coming within a decade, which divided the town between those who saw it as progress and those who understood that progress always costs something. Chester remained of the opinion that the land was the land and would outlast whatever came through it, which was a view Sallie found both practically sound and philosophically satisfying. The schoolhouse garden survived all of it, through 3 more teachers and 10 more years and 2 particularly bad droughts that the spring-fed water line quietly defeated. It became, in a way that nobody had planned, one of the things Harrow Creek was known for, a novelty at first and then a tradition. The garden at the schoolhouse with its solid fence and its reliable water and its seasonal explosion of tomatoes and marigolds, tended by whoever taught in the school and by the children who passed through it year after year. Some of those children grew up and had children of their own and told them about the garden that the first schoolteacher had planted and the quiet rancher who had helped her, and how it had all started with a packet of marigold seeds and a broken pickaxe handle. In 1889, Texas became part of the increasingly settled West, and the wildness of the earlier decade gave way to something more structured and more populated, but still recognizably itself. Chester rode his land every morning as he always had, checking the stock and the fences, and the spring-fed tank that still sent its clean water south to the schoolhouse, and he did it with the satisfaction of a man who has built something lasting. The ranch was in good order and getting better. Grady had retired to a small house in town, replaced by two younger men, and Tom Wick had married a woman named Dorothy and was running a smaller spread of his own north of the Fletcher land, and Chester had lent him the money to start it without being asked and charged no interest, which was the kind of thing he did without announcement. Sallie, in 1889, had begun writing. She had started with letters to the Harrow Creek Gazette, the small weekly paper that had started publication in 1886, writing about the school and the community with a clarity and warmth that the editor, a man named Phipps, found immediately valuable. Then she had begun writing longer pieces about the land and the history of the region and the women who had come west in the Great Migration years and built lives out of almost nothing. The pieces ran in the Gazette, and then in a paper in San Antonio, and then in a journal published in Austin, and they were read by people who had never been to West Texas, and who found in Sallie's words a picture of a place they had not known to imagine. Chester read everything she wrote, sitting in his chair by the fire in the evenings, and when he finished he would look up and say something specific and accurate about what she had done and what it meant, and she found his reading more valuable than any other response she got, because he read with his complete attention and his honest opinion. "This one," he said one evening in 1890, handing back a piece she had written about the first generation of settlers and their relationship to the land, "this one is the best thing you have written." "Do you mean that?" she said. "I do not say things I do not mean," he said, with enough dryness that it was almost humor, and she laughed. James, at 6 years old, was beginning to read with the determined focus of a child who understands that reading is the key to a kingdom, and Sallie taught him in the evenings at the kitchen table the way her mother had taught her, with patience and encouragement and a willingness to read anything he was interested in regardless of subject. Rosa, at 4, declared that she wanted to learn too and sat beside her brother with an expression of supreme competitive focus. "She gets that from you," Sallie told Chester one evening, watching their daughter stare down a reading primer with the intensity of a person planning a siege. "The focus," Chester said. "The absolute refusal to be left behind," Sallie said. He smiled, watching his daughter. "She does not need to be told how to hold her ground," he said, and there was something in his voice that was unmistakably pride. The years rolled forward as years do in good places, full of work and seasons and the particular textures of ordinary life that make up the bulk of happiness. There were hard years, a drought in 1891 that was the worst in memory, and that the spring-fed tank, bless its steady heart, got them through with their garden and a good part of their stock intact. There was a year when James had a fever that kept them both sleepless for a week, and then broke as suddenly as it had come, leaving them both sitting in his room in the early morning with their foreheads touching and their hearts still hammering with fear that had no further object. There was the year Chester broke his wrist badly enough to require a real doctor, and had to endure 6 weeks of not being able to work at full capacity, which was the most genuinely difficult thing Sallie had ever watched him deal with, because the stillness frustrated him deeply, and she managed it with a combination of sympathy and firm practicality that he was grateful for even when he could not entirely show it. There was the year, 1892, when Rosa decided at the age of 6 that she wanted to learn to ride properly, and Chester spent 2 months in the corral every afternoon after his work was done, patient and thorough, teaching her the way his father had taught him, with no shortcuts and no condescension. Sallie watched from the fence on those afternoons with a feeling that she thought she might never be able to fully describe, watching these two people who were the most important things in her life, her serious, dedicated husband and her fierce, focused daughter, working something out between them with quiet mutual respect. Rosa learned to ride beautifully, as she did everything, with complete commitment once she had decided to do it. In the spring of 1893, a decade after she had married Chester Fletcher and moved into the ranch that she had helped, in every meaningful way, to make into a home, Sallie went out to the schoolhouse garden on a Saturday morning and stood at the gate in the April light and looked at what a decade of growing had made of it. The original beds were still there in their places, but the garden had grown over the years into something larger and more established, with a young peach tree at the back corner that one of the later teachers had planted and that now bore fruit, and rose bushes along the fence that might or might not have been Rose's influence, and rows of tomatoes and squash and marigolds that had been replanted every spring for 10 years by various hands. All of them continuing what Sallie had started with a packet of seeds and a borrowed pickaxe in the April of 1882. She thought about that first April. She thought about standing in this very yard with the broken handle in her hands and a man on a bay horse looking at her with those gray-green eyes, telling her calmly and directly that she needed a proper breaking plow. She thought about the Saturday morning he had come with his mule and turned the soil, and the 2 tin mugs of coffee, and the quiet confidence with which he had said, "It will grow." She thought about the night she had convinced herself he was angry with her, and the dark behind the schoolhouse, and the fence posts he had driven with his bleeding hands without telling her. She thought about all of it, and she was so full of gratitude and love and the particular rich completeness of a life that had been built right, that she had to put her hand on the gate post and simply stand there for a moment. Chester's voice came from behind her. "You are going to be late for breakfast." She turned. He was on his horse, having ridden over to meet her, the way he still sometimes did on Saturday mornings, riding the 2 miles from the ranch to the schoolhouse, because it was the same road they had walked together for years, and it was still worth walking. He was looking at her with that direct, complete attention, and behind him the West Texas sky was the deep morning blue that she would never stop finding beautiful. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" he said. "About you," she said. "About all of it, about everything that started here." He looked at the garden, at the fence and the gate and the full green established growth of 10 years of tending. Then he looked back at her. "I was thinking the other morning," he said, "about the first time I rode past here. Before I stopped, I rode past 3 times. She raised her eyebrows. 3 times. "I was working up to stopping," he said without apology. She laughed, clear and warm in the April morning air, and the sound of it moved across the schoolhouse yard and out into the West Texas day. He swung down from his horse and came to stand beside her at the gate, and they looked at the garden together for a moment, the 2 of them, the way they had looked at it all those years ago when it was brand new and full of promise that had not yet been proven. "I want to put roses in at the ranch house," she said. "Along the south fence. Rosa has been asking." "Then we should," he said. "She has your stubbornness," she said. "She has your conviction," he said. "Those are different things." She looked up at him. "Are they?" "Stubbornness is holding a position for its own sake," he said. "Conviction is holding it because you believe in it. Rosa believes in everything she does." Sallie thought about this for a moment. "That is very well put," she said. "I have had years of practice," he said dryly, and she laughed again and took his hand. They rode back to the ranch together through the April morning, the 2 horses moving side by side on the road. Chester had ridden 100 and 100 and 100 times, the road that had carried him past the schoolhouse in the spring of 1882 and back again, for everything that had followed. The land around them was waking into its spring version, the scrubby grass greening up after the winter, the distant hills with their particular rough beauty, the sky overhead enormous and present, and full of the promise that West Texas always seemed to be making, and generally kept. At the ranch house, James and Rosa were at breakfast with the focused energy of children who have been waiting a reasonable amount of time for their parents to return, and have just reached the outer limit of their patience. James, at 9, had his father's composure and was managing it with some success. Rosa, at 7, had given up managing it and was standing at the window watching for them. "They are back," she announced to James, in the tone of a person delivering urgent intelligence, and came running to the door. Chester caught her before she made it entirely out, swinging her up in the easy practiced way of a father who has done this 1,000 times, and she grabbed his hat and put it on her own head, where it descended immediately over her ears. "I want to learn to plant roses today," she announced from beneath the hat. "Good morning to you too," Chester said. "Good morning," she said impatiently. "Can we plant roses?" "We need to get the right roses first," Sallie said, coming in behind them. "The right ones for the West Texas soil. We will look into it this week." Rosa considered this from the depths of the hat. "All right," she said, "but soon." "Soon," Sallie agreed. James at the table looked up from his plate with an expression of serene patience. "Did you see the garden?" he asked his mother. "I did," she said. "Is it ready for spring?" he said. "Nearly," she said. "We will go together next Saturday, all of us, and prepare the beds properly." He nodded with satisfaction. This was how James processed the world, through plans and schedules and the satisfying shape of work that was agreed upon in advance. He was very much his father's son. Sallie made breakfast with Aliner's old iron skillet, the one she had kept after Aliner died because it was the right size, and because it had a history she did not want to lose, and the ranch house kitchen filled with the smell of salt pork and cornbread. And outside the window the April morning continued to be unreasonably beautiful, and Chester sat at the table with his coffee and listened to his children and his wife and the sounds of the house around him, and felt the deep, settled certainty of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. The roses went in that May, along the south fence of the ranch house, a dozen plants that Hattie Prout ordered special from a nursery in San Antonio, and that arrived in a wooden box with their roots wrapped in burlap. Rosa planted every one of them herself, with Chester guiding her hands at the right depth and Sallie watering each one in as it went into the ground, and James standing to one side with the proprietary interest of an older brother who has decided to supervise. They were yellow roses. Rosa had specified yellow because she said yellow was the color of something alive, and nobody had seen any reason to argue with this. By July, they were blooming. By August, they were a full, brilliant hedge of yellow along the south fence, visible from the road, and more than one person passing the Fletcher Ranch on the road north would slow their horse or their wagon to look at them, struck by the unexpectedness of such a thing in that landscape, that overflow of color and living abundance against the dry West Texas brush. Chester would pass them every morning on his way out to the fields, and sometimes he would pause for just a moment and look at them, and think about what it meant that this particular life, in this particular place, with this particular woman and these particular children, had come from a day in a general store and a morning with a breaking plow and a garden built in the dark. He had not built the best garden in West Texas. He knew that. But he had built it for the right person, at the right time, with the right intention, and that had turned out to be the most important garden in the world. On a late August evening in 1893, Sallie sat on the porch of the ranch house with a cup of tea and her latest writing, a long piece about water and land and the way a community grows from the resources it chooses to share, and the yellow roses along the south fence were glowing in the last light, and the children were inside at their lessons, and Chester came around from the barn and saw her there and stopped. She looked up and saw him stop there, looking at her in the evening light. "What?" she said. He shook his head just slightly. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking." She smiled. "You are always looking," she said. "Someone has to," he said, and came up onto the porch and sat beside her, and took her hand in his, and they sat together in the long last light of the August evening, and the roses glowed and the land stretched out around them in all its unruly beauty. And inside the house, their children's voices rose and fell in some minor dispute over a lesson that would resolve itself, as all such disputes did, and the ranch stood solid around them as it had always stood, as it would go on standing. Built of hard work and honest love, and the patience of people who understood that the most important things take time. The years ahead of them were good ones. James grew into a thoughtful, careful young man who loved the land the way his father did, with attention and intention, and who would one day take up the ranch with the same steady competence Chester had brought to it. Rosa grew into a fierce, brilliant woman who would one day leave for Austin and leave again and return again, always carrying West Texas with her in the way that people carry the places where they were rooted. Hattie Prout kept her store and her considerable knowledge of everyone's business for many more years. Tom Wick's spread grew and prospered. The schoolhouse garden outlived them all. And Chester and Sallie Fletcher grew old the way they had grown everything, with patience and intention and steady water and the complete, unambivalent love of two people who had looked at each other clearly from the beginning and had, after a few misunderstandings and one very important night in the dark, chosen each other with full knowledge and full hearts. On their 20th wedding anniversary, in the spring of 1903, Chester took Sallie back to the schoolhouse. They were 52 and 47, and the years sat on them well, the way years sit on people who have used them for good purposes. The schoolhouse had been rebuilt and expanded twice, and the garden had become something of a permanent institution. The peach tree was large now, properly large, with the authority of a thing that has been growing for 20 years and knows its ground. They stood at the gate in the April light, the same light that had been there 20 years before when he had first plowed that ground, the same light that had been there 10 years ago when she had stood here thinking about everything it had meant. "I want to tell you something," Chester said. She looked at him. 20 years of looking at him, and his face still held things she was glad to find. "I was afraid in the beginning," he said. "I was afraid of getting it wrong. I was afraid of asking too much or not enough or at the wrong time." He looked at the garden. "That was why I did things without telling you. The plow, the fence posts, the water line. I could not say the thing I wanted to say, so I built toward it instead." She took his hand. "I know," she said. "I figured that out eventually. It took me years," he said, "to learn to say it plainly. You helped with that." "You helped with everything else," she said. He looked at her. "I love you, Sallie," he said. "I have loved you since the morning you said you supposed you had better start turning the soil, and I have not stopped for one day in the 22 years since." She put her free hand against his face, his sun-dark, serious, beloved face, and looked at him with all the clear attention she had learned partly from him and partly from herself, and partly from the particular school of a life well lived. "I love you, Chester Fletcher," she said, "and I am very glad I was wrong about you that one time." He made the small sound that was almost a laugh. "Just the once," he said. "Just the once," she agreed. They stood at the garden gate in Harrow Creek, Texas, in the April of 1903. In the long golden morning of a life they had built together from broken ground, and the marigolds were coming up in the beds, and the peach tree was in new blossom, and the spring-fed water moved steadily through the pipe that Chester had laid 20 years before, faithful and clear. And the West Texas sky above them was the particular blue that Sallie had once written about as the color of something that does not need to explain itself. It simply is, enormous and present and entirely itself. And this was, as it had always been, exactly enough.